Okay. All right. So this is VMware 6.5. And like I was saying, so I went out and I purchased a Dell PowerEdge R640. So this was about maybe like 300-400 bucks or so. I mean, they you see this is $11,000 right here. But they have they have servers that go all the way up to like $100,000. And you can hear me, right? Just want to make sure.
Yes, yes, I can hear
Okay.
you. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I purchased one of these servers just to basically show you all what you're actually going to be seeing once you get into the work field. So this host is basically the server itself that I purchased. So it has about 12 cores of CPU, about 72 gigabytes of RAM, that's, and about 700 gigabytes of storage. So that's the host itself. So within the host, this is where you now build your virtual machines. So it looks like I have about 3 virtual machines currently running that I have built within my host, and that's exactly how you would do it. So you can have multiple hosts. Once you get into the work field, you'll see you'll have multiple hosts, and within these hosts is where you basically build your virtual machines. 9 times out of 10, you'll have a team that manages the VMware level, that administers the VMware level. So you yourself as a sysadmin, you build the virtual machines within the host and you administer anything on the OS level. But this VMware itself, most likely you'll have a VMware admin that will that will administer items on the VMware level because they don't want to just give permissions out to everyone on a level like this. So so I built 2 virtual machines here, and the process is exactly the same, like you've seen in VMware Workstation. So building a virtual machine here is exactly the same. So you'll you'll go to virtual machines. You click virtual machines here, and you click create slash register virtual machine. So you select that, so create a new virtual machine. You go to next, give your virtual machine name a name. So we'll call this Lab 3, and this is running on ESXi 6.5. And the guest OS family is a Linux. It's a Linux system that we're building, and we're going to use CentOS 7. This is not the actual ISO. You're just naming your system right now, just giving it the names. So now go to next. This is the storage that we're selecting from. So once you get into the work field, you'll see multiple data stores. So this data store is the storage that's on the host. So that's the storage that we're going to use to build our system. That's what we're selecting, but we haven't assigned the amount of storage that we're going to allocate to our system yet. We're just selecting where we are going to be pulling the storage from. So now we
Got it.
hit next. All right, so now this is where it gives you now the ability to customize your system. So CPU, we're going to give it about 2. Um, Memory, give it about 4 gigs. So let's change this one to gigabytes. And hard disk one, hard disk one your um, is what you're going to basically partition. So let's give this one, let's give it about 30 gigabytes. And we come down to our CD-ROM section, and you go to data store ISO file, and now we select the ISO. So we want to use CentOS 7. That's actually what I'm going to select, CentOS 7. So exact same process. Uh, Now once that's complete, you hit next, and then you hit finish, and we have our lab 3 here. And now you can select it and you can power on your system. So now that it's powering on, you can now highlight over your system, go to console, and open console in new window. No, let's not do a new window. Let's do a new tab. So details. So now it's going to basically bring up the console just like that. So that's our console. You hit enter to get into it. And the process now is exactly the same to what we all know. So I'm not going to go through the process, but this is the exact process, just building a regular, going through the steps of basically just building a regular virtual machine. So basically what I wanted to show you all was what VMware ESXi 6.5 looks like. So they'll ask you, what version of VMware do you use? VMware ESXi 6.5. You can do more research on this. If you want to get fancy, you can actually you can buy yourself a server. They're about $200 or so, and I can help you get it configured. I have resources or so to help you get it all configured, so you can just have your own testing environment. Like this server, I'm actually using it for my job. So I bought it for myself, but it's come in handy to just test some few things for my job. This system here that says platform, that's actually for my job. So yeah, so it can help a lot. You know, you can have different applications running on your server that can you know, you can download music, movies, and all sorts of different things. But we're not going to go into that. But yeah, so this is basically VMware 6.5, and this is exactly what you're going to see. Most of the time, you'll build your systems using templates, so you can convert your system actually to a template that you'll use to basically build multiple systems at a time, instead of having to go through the whole process of building your virtual machine from scratch. You can build one system as a baseline, convert your system into a template, and basically create virtual machines off that template, almost as if you're just cloning it. All right. So that's VMware 6.5. So now we're going to hop right into one of the topics. So the topic that we ended with the last time was web service. So now we're going to hop into the next one, which is DNS. So DNS. So DNS, domain name server. DNS is basically allows your IP address and your host name to resolve one another. So so you build a DNS server, you configure it, and any new system that is built, you'll take that IP address and the host name of that system and place it into your DNS server configuration files, which will then allow the IP address and the host name to resolve each other. So now you'll be able to access the system using the host name instead of the IP address, because it's much easier to remember a system by the host name than the IP address. All right, so now let's get right into it. I'm going to send over some documentation for building a DNS server, but for now we're going to go through each of the steps that I have here, and we'll go ahead and build it out, and I'll send over the documentation for you all to try it yourself. Once you get into the work field, 9.9 times out of 10, you're not going to need to build a DNS server. The company will already have one in place, but it's always good to know how it is built from scratch. So in case you run into any issues, you'll know exactly where to go to troubleshoot any issues you may find. All right. So I have two systems here. These are actually the two virtual machines that I built here, Lab 1 and Lab 2. All right, so Lab 1 and Lab 2. So this is Lab 1, and this one is Lab 2. So sorry, this is Lab 1 and that's Lab 2. All right. So let me actually change the host name of this system first so that I don't get confused. Lab 1. And let's change the host name of this one. Host name CTO set host name Lab 2. Okay. I'll have to exit out and log back in order to see the changes. But if you just type host name, you'll see that host name is now Lab 1. All right, so Lab 1 is going to be our DNS server. So this is going to be our dedicated DNS server. So the first thing you want to do is you want to install an application called Bind. So you want to install Bind. So let's go ahead and install Bind. So yum install Bind, and we'll include the asterisk there to basically indicate that we want to install all packages related to Bind. So Bind is the main package needed to be able to get your DNS server configured. All right. Do you recall what port is used for DNS?
I believe, okay, I'll guess off of my head for real. I think it is port 53.
Yep, that's correct. And that is, it's also an interview question. So, yeah, make sure you know those by heart. All right, so we have Bind now installed. And with Bind now being installed, it now provides the file called named.conf. So named.conf is the main one of the configuration files that you would configure initially. This is for building your DNS server from scratch. You're not usually going to need to do this, but it's good to know how to do just in case you're ever put in that situation, and also to know where to go to troubleshoot different items. So name.conf. All right. So this file can look a bit intimidating, but there are only a few parameters inside of this file that you need to change. So I'm going to go down to this line here, and we are going to place here the IP address of our DNS server, and that's the IP address of this system that we're currently on. So that's 192.168.1.11. And let's not forget to include this colon here. I'm going to provide you the documentation for all of this, so you can follow along just for now. So 192.168.1.11. So this section here is to include, you need to include the IP address of your server. So this is indicating, hey, this is the primary DNS server, and this is the master DNS IP address, which basically belongs in this location. All right.
Quick question, Ben.
Yep.
So this IP address that you just put in, that is the IP address for Lab 1 ultimately?
Yep, for Lab 1. So this system here, right there, 192.168.1.11. Yep. So we're Lab 1 is going to be our DNS server. And the thing about DNS, configuring DNS from scratch, is one tiny mistake can become like a needle in a haystack. So you have to make sure you're precise with all the changes that you're making, only when you're first building it from scratch. That's why you'll never usually have to do this once you get into the field, because a DNS server is important. You know, you'll have your web addresses all inside of the DNS server, which correlate from the DNS from the website name and the IP address for it to resolve each other. All right, so now let's go down to this line here. And this line here is basically now going to indicate the IP address range of any system that can communicate with our DNS server. So the IP address range that we're going to use is 192.168.1.0/24. So this is basically indicating that any IP within the range of 192.168.1.1 all the way to 255 will be able to communicate with this DNS server. All right, so now we're going to, I'm going to show you here. I'm going to copy this line. You know what? Let me just grab it from here. All right. So this line here is, let me paste it here. Okay. Okay, so this line I just pasted, allow transfer localhost 192.168.1.x, right? Let's say 1.13, right? I'm gonna comment out this line because we're not going to need it, but I'm gonna explain to you exactly what this line is for. So this line is basically, Lab 1 is our primary DNS server, right? You don't want just to have one DNS server. You want to have a primary, you want to have a secondary. Because if anything happens to your primary DNS server, you want your secondary to now kick in. So this line, allow transfer, is for a second DNS server if we were to build one, right? So if you were to build a second DNS server, you would basically place the IP address of that DNS server here. This is where you'll place that IP address. But this is not an actual system that I've built, but I'm just letting you know that if you did have a second DNS server, you would place the IP address of that system here. It'll be allow transfer with localhost, the IP address of the new DNS, secondary DNS server, which will basically fail over to the secondary if my primary Lab 1 goes down. But I've commented out with the hash, basically indicating that is not going to be read. This line is not going to be read inside of this file once it's executed. All right, so the next change we want to make, we want to go to the bottom of the file, or not all the way to the bottom, but right before this line here. I'm going to paste some content inside of this line here, and I'm going to explain to you exactly what is going on. All right, paste. Okay. All right, so I just pasted basically from here, zone, to this bracket here. So this is basically indicating, did I paste that twice or once? Oh, that was not supposed to be pasted. This can go. And that can go as well. Pasted too much. All right. So this is basically indicating the forward and reverse zones. Is basically, once we get into the configurations of two primary files, you're going to understand why this is here. Uh, it's basically calling these two files here: reverse home.local and forward home.local. So with DNS, you have forward and you have reverse zones, and that's how DNS works. So the way your IP address and your host name are able to resolve, you'll place them both inside of a forward and reverse zone um, file, in two files, which then allows the host name and the IP address to both resolve. You don't need to really you're like I told you, you're not going to have to do this once you get into the work field, but just trying to show you exactly the exact process on how this is done. So you see this, if your IP address is in a different range, you see my IP address is going in reverse. So it's 1.168.192. So 192.168.1. So if you have an IP range of like 10.1.24 or so, you'll basically put that in reverse on this line. But I'm going to send you all this documentation for you to be able to review as well. But since this is in my IP, this is basically the same IP address I have. I'm not going to make any change here. So 192.168.1, and it's just basically just put in reverse. All right. So everything looks good here. And you want to really make sure that you're precise and haven't fat fingered anything. And I'm actually kind of worried that I made a mistake somewhere. So let me undo these changes that I put here. Okay. All right, so it brought me back up here. I was just hitting the U button to undo. All right. So now let's go back to the bottom here. All right, so that was actually already there, that zone section. So let me recopy what I had there before and let me place it back here. So like I said, you have to be really precise with what you're doing inside this file especially, and other files as well, because one tiny mistake, you'll be now looking basically for a needle in a haystack when it comes to DNS. So everything else looks fine inside of this file, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save it. All right. All right. So now that we have that file configured, now we are going to configure our forward and our reverse zone files. All right. So I'm going to vi var named, and this file here, fwd, is not present. So I'm going to, when you VI into a file and you make changes and save it, it actually creates that file. So this is our first zone file that we're going to configure. So this is our forward zone that we need to now configure. So forward home.local. So that's we're going to configure two files, our forward zone and our reverse zone. So I'm going to VI into this file. All right, so now I'm going to paste some content into this file, and I'm going to basically explain to you what is going on in here. All right. Okay. All right, so I want to make some few changes here. So this is the host name. Oh, I'm placing the host name. I'm replacing basically master DNS with the host name of my system. So it's lab1.home.local. And actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to save this file really quick, and I want to make an adjustment to my host name. So host name CTL set host name lab1 home.local. All right, so now let's go back into our forward. So lab1.home.local. And we're going to make a change here as well, where it says master DNS. That's the host name, basically, of your DNS server. So lab1.home.local. And you see down here, we have slave DNS.home.local. So slave DNS will basically indicate if you had a second DNS server. So let's say your lab1, your primary DNS server went out. It will now fail over to your secondary. But we don't have one, so I'm going to basically just delete this line. And here we have master DNS as well, and I'm going to replace that with lab1. And I'm going to go all the way to the right here and correct the IP address. So lab1's IP address is 1.11. And now you see at the bottom here, we have slave DNS. We don't have a slave DNS, which is our secondary DNS server if we had one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete that line as well. So this is basically how your forward zone is going to look. So this content here, I'm going to explain to you once we get a little further. So you have your serial number, and that is all you're going to basically need to worry about. But once we get this all configured, I'm going to show you exactly why this serial line is important. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this file. So that's our forward zone that we just configured. And now we're going to configure our reverse zone. So we had forward and we had a reverse zone. So the reverse home.local file is not present, but if you VI into a file, or you can just touch it and then VI into it. So reverse home.local. And I'm going to place some content into here as well. All right. And we're going to basically do the same here as well. So anywhere that has master DNS, we're going to replace with the host name of our system, which is our primary DNS server. And here as well, we're going to make this change here as well. Update that to lab1. We do not have a slave DNS. And we're going to update here as well. We're going to change this line here to lab1, exactly how we saw it. And we're going to change that IP address again to .11. We do not have a slave DNS. This here is our slave DNS, which is our secondary DNS if we had one. We do not have one, so we're going to delete that line. And the next line, this 200 you're seeing is basically the last octet of your IP address. So you remember we saw up here, before we changed it, it said 192.168.1.200, but we changed that to .11. So we're going to change this here also to 11. And we're going to update this master DNS section here as well to lab1. And this bottom one here is our slave DNS, and we do not have a slave DNS. So we can go ahead and we can remove that as well. So those are the changes that need to be made here. And we'll go ahead and we will save this as well. So now that we have made the changes to our forward and our reverse zone, we are now going to start the daemon called named. So systemctl start named. So named is basically the service that is running for DNS. So now we hit enter and let's hope. Okay, so it's telling me that there is an error somewhere. So job for name service failed because the control process exited with error code. All right, so basically we fat fingered somewhere in our configuration, and I'm sure that it's inside of the name.conf file. So now let's go back into this file, and I think I already see where I made that, where I missed. Okay, so right here, 192.168.1.0/24, I actually need a colon, and good thing I saw that. But you'll see that in the documentation as well. So you basically need a colon right there at the end there. So once you're starting that name service, is actually executing this file as well. It's going through this file, making sure everything is correct. And if it's not correct, it's going to fail. So let me go through the rest here, just make sure everything else looks fine. And I believe that we should be okay now. So I believe everything looks okay here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to save this file. And now let's go ahead and let's try and start named. And it looks like it was able to start with no errors. Let's check the status. All right, so looks to be active and running. All right, so that is now started. And do you recall how, so the named service is now running, but if we reboot it, we're going to have to start it again. So how, what can I do? What change can I make so that once I reboot my system, that named service will continue to run?
You'll run a systemctl enable named.
Yep. Good stuff. Enabled named.
Yeah.
Oh. Oops. Enable name. Yep. Yeah. So it created a symlink, basically indicating that once the system is rebooted and it comes back up, that service will automatically be started. All right. So if we had a
real quick. So you know how you first started the service, then checked the status, and then we did enable. If you ran systemctl right from the beginning and did enable, what would happen? Do you know?
If you did that, it will. What you're doing is basically telling the system after it reboots that it needs to start it. If you enable it, it's not going to start the service. It's just telling me that, okay, after I reboot the system, you're telling me you want the service to now start running. That's basically what enabled or check config is doing. But it is not going to actually start the service. You're going to have to start it first by just doing start. But it won't fail. It won't fail just because it's not running. Yeah, it won't fail, but it will start the service the next time the system is rebooted.
I see. Thank you.
All right. So now, if we had a firewall running, let's see, firewall D, which we do, if we kept this running, that means we'll have to open up port 53 on TCP and UDP. But I'm just going to just stop the firewall. But we know the process of opening ports using firewall.
Yes.
Yeah, so we know that process. So, and I'm going to actually disable firewall D, basically indicating that on reboot, even though I stopped it, if I rebooted my system, it will come back up. So I permanently disabled it so that on reboot, it's not going to come back up. All right, so it's basically removed the symlink. So remember when we did enabled, it created the symlink. So enabled created symlink, disabled will remove the symlink. All right, so now that we've made those changes to our configuration files and we started the name service and everything looks good there. There are basically some DNS checks um, that you can run to basically confirm that everything inside of your file is correct. And this is all in the documentation as well. So this here, named checkconf etc name.conf. So when you run that and you get nothing in return, that basically indicates that that name.conf configuration file, everything basically looks okay there. So these are just some checklist items that can be run just to make sure that everything is okay in that file. And this will be run as well. It's all in the documentation. And this basically indicates, with nothing in return, indicates that our configurations so far are correct. And we made changes to our forward zone as well. Forward, we created files forward and reverse. So we want to basically check those as well. So we want to check those, and we got the OK back, basically indicating that there are no issues there as well. All right, and we want to do the same for our reverse zone as well. So we did it for the forward right here, and now we're going to do it for the reverse. So we got the OK there as well. All right, so the last thing we want to do is we want to go to resolve.conf. So resolve.conf is where you place your DNS server. So this is our primary DNS server, and we want to basically place the contents of our system here now, because this is now our primary DNS server. So search lab1.home.local. So the search will then be followed by the host name of your DNS server, and the name server is basically the IP address of your DNS server, which is 192.168.1.11. All right, so let's go ahead and let's save that. And now we have DNS now configured. But at the same time, now we need to test this. We need to test this and make sure that everything that we've done is working before, we present it to your team, or you implement it into your environment. You want to start testing first. So the first thing you can do to make sure that everything is resolving correctly is you can run a command called, there are various commands that you can run. So you can run a dig command, a dig followed by the host name of your system, lab1.local. So dig lab1.local. Once you hit enter, you're basically, what you're looking for is this line here. You see where it says answer section, lab1.home.local. If you get an answer section, that's what you have to look for, answer section. Answer section basically indicates that, hey, everything is resolving correctly. So lab1.home.local is now resolving to 192.168.1.11. So that's if you have to see this answer section. So let me give you an example. Let me go to resolve.conf here, and let me comment these out, right? I'm gonna comment these out. And now let's do a dig again. Let's do a dig. So I just did a dig. Okay, let me restart DNS. System CTL restart named. All right, so now let's do a dig again. Oh, okay, still showing the answer section. I guess it likes everything that we've done. I was trying to just make a mistake purposely, just to show you what it would look like if it wasn't configured correctly. But a dig followed by the host name, and you need to look out for this answer section. Answer section basically indicates that, hey, your configurations are correct. Everything seems to be resolving. So we did a dig on the host name. So now let's try the IP address. If you want to do the IP address, you'll do a dig-x followed by the IP address. So 192.168.1.11. All right. And we see the answer section here. And you'll see that lab1.home.local is resolving to 192.168.1.11. So it looks like everything is resolving with no issue. So those are one of the two ways to check and make sure that your system is resolving the host name and IP address correctly. This is just for testing purposes on your DNS server before you actually just say, okay, this is our DNS server. So the next thing you can do is an NS lookup, which is the most common. So NS lookup followed by the host name. So let's just do lab1, right? Did not like that. Oh, it didn't like that. Lab1 home.local. Okay, yeah. So NS lookup on lab1.home.local. And it's resolving correctly. It's telling me that this is my host name, and it's actually providing the IP address of that host name. So, which is indicating that our changes so far look correct. All right. So now that we have made those changes, so now what I can actually do, lab1.home.local. You see, now I can ping my host name. Instead of just pinging 192.168.1.11, I can now ping the host name of my DNS server, right? So it's basically my host name and my IP address are now one, but this is my primary DNS server. So now when I start building other systems, which I'm about to show you what you will do. So now everything here is now running correctly with no issue. I've been able to resolve. Let's actually do an NS lookup on the IP address 192.168.1.11. All right, and it likes that as well. So NS lookup on my IP address gives me back my host name. So that looks good there as well. So now let's say you built a new system, right? You've built a new system and you want to add that system to your DNS server, right? And this is the new system right here. This one is Lab2, right? So let's say we want to add Lab2 to our to DNS. So let's ping Lab2. Oh, it's actually allowing me to ping it. Let's check. Let's see host file. I don't know why it's allowing me to ping it. Well, let's do an NS lookup on Lab2. Okay, so you see I did an NS lookup on Lab2, and it's not providing me the IP address, right? So let's do an NS lookup on 192.168.1.12 of this system, and it's telling me that it's not giving me any response. It's not resolving. My host name and my IP address are not properly resolving. So now what we can do is we can add this new system that we just built, Lab2, to our DNS, and this is exactly how it's done. So you need to update your forward and your reverse zone files with the new system's IP address and host name. So we're going to edit the first. Let's edit the that's var named forward home.local. Let's go into this file and let's go to the very bottom of the file, and we're going to add Lab2 here. So Lab2, or actually let's do it like this. let's just copy this line, change this to lab 2, and let's go to the end of that and change that to 12. So that's the first thing that's done. And any change that is made to your forward or your reverse zone files, you always need to remember, you need to come to your serial number here, and you need to change this number to a 2. So the next time you come in here, you make a change or you add anything else to it, you change it to a 3. And you'll do this all the time. This is done all the time. You update your serial number every time a change is made to this file. And that is an interview question. So you need to be aware of that. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's save this. So we added lab 2 there, and now we need to update our reverse zone file. All right, so let's go to the very bottom. Let's copy this line right here. We're going to change that 11 to a 12 because that's the last octet of our IP address of lab 2, 192.168.1.12. And we're going to change this host name here to lab 2, but it's not home.local, it's just lab 2, just like that. And what we're going to do now is change the serial number. So now let's change the serial number to a 2 because we just made a change here. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's save that. And now let's do a systemctl restart named. All right, so now that's restarted. So now let's go back over to lab 2. Before we do anything, we need to go into our DNS. So whenever someone tells you to check DNS on your system, it's etcresolve.conf. etcresolve.conf. So if you ever hear check your DNS, check etcresolve.conf. So we're going to update our name server. You can actually we can actually add the search lab1.home.local. So this is our primary DNS server. We need to place that here because now our system is going to now be pointing to our primary DNS server. So now let's change that name server to 192.168.1.11. Right? So now lab 2 is now connected and now pointing to lab1.home.local. So now let's try and test this here. Let's cross our fingers. All right, look at that. We just did an NS lookup on 192.168.1.12, and this is our DNS server here, and it's telling me that the host name is lab 2. And this is the IP address. So now let's actually do a dig on lab 2. Is it lab 2? No, let's do a dig -x 192.168.12. All right, so 192.168.1. Dig -x on 192.168.1.12. I am getting the answer section here, which provides lab 2's information here as well. And I believe, let's go back here and let's check our reverse zone. So your host name is going to have this lab 2. When I created it with a short host name. Most of the time you would have a fully qualified domain name, as in this is your host name and everything else that comes after it is your company's domain. So let's say you work for like Verizon, right? It'll be like lab2.verizon.com, and that's the host name of your system. So I'm like the company I'm working for, they'll have the host name of their system. It'll be like Spark FE2. That's the host name, and then the domain after that will be sparkfe2.philips.com. So that's basically how it would look in here. You'll have the fully qualified domain in here, or maybe it's complaining because it doesn't have a period there, because you actually need one there. Let's check our forward zone. Looks good there. Oh, I actually just made a change in here. You see, I added a dot. I added that period there. So since I made a change in here, I need to come back up here and I need to change this serial to a 3 because a change was made inside this file. If I did not change that serial to a 3 and I restarted the name, it wouldn't catch it. It wouldn't catch it at all. All right, so now let's go back over here. Let's clear that. Let's do a dig on lab 2. Doesn't look like it's still liking it too well, but it's liking my IP address because I'm getting the answer section. And that's exactly what I was telling you. You see, I did a dig on lab 2 and you don't see answer, right? You don't see nothing here that says answer. This got answer, that's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for got answer. What we're looking for is answer section. Answer section basically indicates, okay, everything looks good. All right. So if I do like I did an NS lookup on 192.168.1.12, okay, you see I corrected that dot, and now it's resolving properly now, much more properly. So that's basically DNS for you. So any new system that is built, you update your forward and your reverse zone. So any system that's built, you come to var named either forward or var named reverse. So you add the new systems here. So if you build 2 systems, you make the change and you update your serial number. The serial number is always key. And in an interview, they're not going to actually tell you, hey, what do you update inside of a file after you have added a system to your forward and reverse zone? What do you change? They're not going to tell you that. They're going to tell you the way the question might be phrased is, they'll tell you, okay, you've built 2 new systems and you need to add them to DNS. How do you do that in your environments if you're familiar with that? You tell them that you'll update the forward and reverse zone files, and then you'll also update the serial number. What they're basically looking for is to know that you know to update the serial number. So that's basically it. These 2 files are basically what you're going to be interacting with the most if you are making changes to DNS. Bind is what some companies use. Some companies might use a different service in general, but this is essentially what you would do. If it's a different service, instead of bind that we installed here, you're also having a forward and reverse zone files, and you're going to update the IP address and the host name, which is pretty straightforward. So yeah, so this is basically it here for DNS. Any questions?
I had something that came across my mind, but I can't remember. So I'll probably send it in a text if I remember it.
Okay. All right. All right. So that is it for DNS.